Welcome to Wind Dancing, the story of one woman's life, loves, and search for meaning. Written by ZOE CHILCO with original music. The Prelude, 1889. Jackie, wait! Wait up! Annie watched her brother's head disappear below the ridge of the hill. The sun was glistening on the edge of Bar Lake, where she knew he was headed, and she was momentarily distracted by the expanse of fields and flowers surrounding her. It was her favorite place, especially in early spring, and she was excited that day to be allowed to go with her older brother. Mammy was very strict with her, likewise her da, in spite of all her protests. "But I walk to the school myself, ma'am, and I go to the shops for you." "Yes, a store. But the fields are wide and cover a lot of area, and the banks of the lake are too dangerous for an 8-year-old all alone." "It's so pretty there, mammy, and I love the birds." "It's beautiful, that's sure, and we're lucky to live in the middle of it all." Jack was already at the water's edge when Annie reached the top of the hill. She watched him walking the muddy border and dragging a huge broken tree limb through the water. "Come on, Annie," he called, as he looked back up the hill. "You can see the bottom. It's so clear." He laughed as he saw his younger sister almost tumble forward in her run down hill, her expression undergoing a sudden change from joy to fear. "You're all right," he hollered. "Slow down a bit." Annie caught up with him and gave him a mock cuff on his shoulder. "Mammy says you're to wait for me or I can't come here." "Ah, you're all right, as long as we can see each other." Jack and Annie spent a lot of time together. It was never known how they both came to be in the water together.
In the deep stillness that surrounds us, let me dance a song that's new, where the sweetness of love and its mercies abound, where I soar high above to a heavenly sound, in the cool silvery air alone with you, in the cool silvery air alone with you.
1978. The sun was shining as the jet thrust itself powerfully into the early spring sky, hauling its cargo and shrinking the world in a few moments to the toy display of fields and roads. Small patches of frozen water held on stubbornly in the bay of the huge lake below, the last holdouts in the final days of March. Stephanie leaned her head against the window and watched the panorama slowly glide by in mute testimony of the smallness of human lives, while her mind simultaneously traveled its inevitable philosophic pathways. Unexpectedly, an image of Tep flickered before her inner musings, and although the real-life journey she was embarking on was born of their long-ago love affair, in her mind she simply greeted him with the involuntary smile that always accompanied thoughts of him. She was already floating in physical and mental ether. She didn't want to lose herself emotionally too just then, so she chose to distract herself with a letter from her sister. Stephanie's sister Yolande was 10 years younger, Together they bookended the proud young immigrant's New World family of 4. The 2 princes in between, her brothers, commanded Old World privilege from their mother, an extravagance not tolerated by their father or their older sister, but which they used to their advantage wherever possible. "Dear Teppy," she read, and she smiled again at the strange turn of events that had evolved so that now she had her former lover's name. "Callie wanted me to write to you. She was upset with your leaving just before her birthday, your lovely gift notwithstanding. You know how sensitive 10-year-old girls can be, and you are her cherished Aunt Teppy. It doesn't seem possible that 10 years have gone by since we first brought that tiny new life home. And it was her who started that silly name when she couldn't say Aunt Stephanie. I never imagined we'd all get used to that, especially after your first name change caused such an uproar. I can still hear Dad. Ilona is proud, beautiful name. A tradition in our culture. What is this Stephanie nonsense?" Denying roots was unacceptable to him. It was only when you told him that Stephanie was just the Americanized version of Stefana, your second name, also his name, and that he should be flattered at the tribute to him, that he accepted it grudgingly. And now here we all are, following Callie and teppying you. No problem. Stephanie read the letter with pleasure, catching up on the family news. How bizarre it all was, but how typical of the way her life seemed to go. People and events all fit together in a strange mix of coincidence and serendipity, to the point where her friends would speak of having a teppy occurrence, when paths and people formed a meaningful and unexpected confluence. But synchronicity was normal for her now. At least, she had finally come to accept that there did seem to be some kind of charmed plan to her life. It was not always so. Born Ilona Stefana Szabo in Hungary after the death of an elder sister, she became the only child of her parents, emigrating with them to a new and emerging country where they all had to work hard, to fit in, to work, to survive. Her father, a skilled cabinet maker who did beautiful inlay in fine polished woods, had to struggle to establish himself and gain the work he had done for so long in Hungary. Her mother, educated in languages, taught English to Italian and Hungarian immigrants and French to wealthy New Yorkers until the children became her full-time job. And Ilona worked hard to blend in and to learn English and a different way of life. She chafed in the horribly old-world and childish outfits her mother insisted she wear, arguing and pleading with her mother to no avail. "You will wear them. These are fabrics your father works hard to pay for." And from her father, "Ilonka, your mother is making this dress for you, and so much trying to make you proud. It is beautiful dress, and sewing she has learned in Hungary." "But, Papa, I am not Hungarian. I'm American. We're in America now, and nobody wears dresses like this. I hate them." "Please, Ilonka, do not make a fight. Let us walk, and we will look at the wonderful buildings here." And with his arm tenderly around her, Stefan Szabo melted his daughter's defenses and anger, and, pointing out the marvelous styles and structures of New York City's greatest buildings, he slowly implanted his love of architecture in the young girl. She worked hard at school, fighting the taunting and the isolation, and throwing herself into her studies, making her parents proud. Early on, she understood she had the brains to do well, to make something of herself, and she knew she wanted to do that for herself, to keep her insatiable mind occupied, to show those taunting and mean classmates that she would surpass them, but also for her parents, to repay their years of sacrifice and hopes. She had to work at home, too. The 5 years between her and her first brother bestowed a role of mother's helper on her, which at 6 years of age she happily accepted. By the time she was 12, however, she was itching to run, to escape the embarrassment of their frugal lives, and to do something big on her own. One day, she was 10 or 11, her mother caught a glimpse of the woman next door, a rare occurrence. and cautioned her daughter about marriages that could be a trap. "I am happy with your father, you know this, but there are men, like the husband of that poor woman, who are not good, who mistreat their wives badly. Do you remember Susie, our other neighbor, who lives in the apartment next door?" She had hung out a kimono, a long white one with Japanese letters on it. It was dancing on a line in the wind, and it made such a pretty picture. I saw the lady with the bad husband watching it, and I thought to myself that she was wishing to dance like that, to be free like that. Good love will make you dance, Ilona. Make sure, when you love, that you are still free to be yourself. In spite of her reluctance to dwell on Tep, remembering that definition of love, along with the coincidence of their names, brought his presence to her.
In the bar, you were a star, a playing on the stage. I was alone, I was unknown, it was a difficult age. I never dreamed that in between the sets you'd come and talk to me, but there you were, there you were. I didn't know what was to be. You said your name, I did the same.
1955. Mind if I sit here? Ilona looked up from her book to see the well-dressed gentleman addressing her at her table. She had dropped into the jazz bar on a whim, feeling just a little bored with her normal routine of work, study, sleep, and cooking for herself. As she took in the man's face and attire, her mind started flying in a million directions. "That's the guy who was just playing on stage," said one part of her brain. Another answered, "Don't be ridiculous. Why would he be talking to me?" "Well, it's him. You were just watching him for the last hour. You did see him." But such was her disbelief that she managed to confuse her memory of what he had even looked like, until her mind screamed, "He's asking you a question. Answer!" Ilona was already saying, "Sure, sit down," even as the split-second internal argument had bombarded her brain. A third part of her was perfectly poised and was nodding with a smile. So Tep sat down, this famous pianist who was touring the country with name bands and recording and at an age when most kids were still in school. She hadn't even been born then. She had recognized his name when she went into the club and had heard his music occasionally, but she didn't know his extensive background, his years of experience. As she smiled her acquiescence, she thought to herself, "Probably a typical egotistic musician on the road and on the make. He'll no doubt talk endlessly about himself." But the old-world gentility of her parents' European background, drilled into her and her siblings, prevailed. He sat, and then Tep charmed her utterly. He did talk a bit about himself, explaining first his name and how someone had started calling him that many years ago, when they'd seen his initials on a suitcase. Timothy Edward Peterson, named for two of his great-grandfathers, had always been Tim at school and at home, but the minute Sam called him Tep, it had stuck. And over the years, that name became synonymous with free-spirited and swinging jazz that could also evoke warm and sweet moments of sublime tenderness. As he talked, he gave her a brief and funny account of himself and his life. Ilona couldn't help liking him, in spite of her reserve. And then he was asking about her and her interests, and listening to what she was saying. She felt herself enveloped in a warmth that took her by surprise, but which also felt familiar and totally comfortable. They passed the break easily with conversation and laughs, and when he invited her to come with him to greet a friend, she suddenly realized that she was being invited to be with him, perhaps to be more than just brief company. She thought to herself, "Well, if he is wanting more, I don't mind at all," and she went along happily.
Will you love me? Will you give me some time? Will you kiss me? Will you really be mine? Will you open up your heart to me? Will you be the way I want you to be? Will you say the things I like you to say? Will you love me every single day?
1956. She watched Tep as he considered his next move, all his attention focused on the Scrabble board. For the past year, they had been lovers, spending 3 or 4 days together each time he played New York. It deepened the love she had felt since their first night. As they had left the club that night, it was clear Tep was going home with her, and she, aware of her initial judgment of his being on the make, realized that in fact she no longer objected to a rendezvous with this man who had so won her heart. He was her heart, she felt, right from the start, although she never understood how or why she knew this with such certainty. "Come on, man," she said. "Your time's up." Tep looked up from his rack of letters. He pulled a lock of his straight black hair from his forehead and grinned wryly. "That's the trouble with this game," he said. "You can't improvise. Somebody's going to drag out a dictionary and tell you there's no such word. Now, jazz, it doesn't limit you. It lets you create." Ilona sat back to let him take some more time, thinking again of their sojourns together, often enough to deepen the love, and scarce enough to make the time apart seem too long. Meeting Tep and seeing him only caused her to realize how much she needed and wanted love. But his life was on the road, and when he was home, it was across the country in San Francisco, where on top of everything else, there was a wife. She never asked for changes, she just accepted and enjoyed what they did have. Tep was more than 20 years older than her. He'd established his life, whereas she was just in the early years of her career in architecture. She had stayed home longer than she'd planned, helping her father through some hard years after her mother died, and she remained innocently old world, tethered to her parents' memories, their romantic idealism. When she finally did go out on her own, she lived to honor them and was alone, studying a lot and working to complete her education. Tep said, "You're always studying something." And she was. Even after her courses, she augmented her work with other classes of interest. Tep finally put his letter on the board. 2 pieces, not a lot of points. Ilona couldn't help feeling pleased with herself when she came out the winner, then immediately felt ashamed of her pride. He didn't need that kind of boost. He was confident in everything he did, and on top of that, he had jazz. It was part of why she loved him. She never dreamed that Tep needed her as she did him, and just allowed their being together to grow into love. The dichotomy between the love that blossomed and her own pragmatic passivity never split her consciousness or her happiness. She didn't ask for more.
I've got a brand new lover. He made signs to me, and when he looked my way, I felt that he could see the winding twists and turns that make the road within my heart. He would travel in there.
1957. "You should go to California," Tep said to her one time. "You'd fit in there. You'd like it." "I don't know anything about that part of the country," she said. "Tell me about it. In fact, I don't know anything about your growing up there. Tell me about that, too." They were walking in Central Park on a bright and clear autumn day, spending some time before Tep's gig that night. They sat on a sunny bench, and Ilona waited for him to speak. Tep leaned back on the bench. "Well," he drawled in a mock southern fashion, "I was born way back in '04 in a little place called San Francisco, which, by the way, I just learned recently was called Yerba Buena for a period of time. It means good herb in Spanish. Then it reverted to its original name. My mother and father married there in 1898, and I was the second last of our little family of 4 kids. We lived a pretty idyllic life in the Bay. My parents had met on the boat coming over to America from Scotland. My 2 older sisters liked to baby me. That was a good start." Tep smiled impishly. "But I found out early in life not to relax too much in all that sunshine. The great San Francisco earthquake happened when I was only 2 years old, and then there was the huge fire. Maybe my brain got shaken up then." Again the grin. "Maybe that was my first lesson in jazz, in being ready for anything. But both my parents loved music and influenced all of us kids to play instruments and listen to lots of styles. We had a piano, which I took to early, and of course by the time I was 10, and all through the war years, the famous Jelly Roll Morton, who liked to say he was the inventor of jazz, was performing in California. He was flashy and innovative. He made music fun. I think he didn't record until after 1923, but we saw him live one time. And at home, Ari and my sister Amy and I used to listen to music and dance to all the latest ragtime. Scott Joplin, Eubie Blake. I liked Eubie's playing. And then later on, Irving Berlin and his Alexander's Ragtime Band. Here's another tidbit for you. That old romantic tune, I love you truly. That was the first one composed by an American woman to sell 1 million copies in 1901. That's a lot of sales, even today. There was lots of blues around, too, starting back in the early part of the century. Ma Rainey, W.C. Handy. Lots of them. "Who was Ari?" Ilona asked. "Was he a classmate?" "Ari was Ariadne," Tep answered, "a classmate of my sister's. She loved to dance. She was studying with Ella Mulcahy, a friend of Ari's Aunt Delia, who came over from Ireland in 1913 on the ship Majestic. Wouldn't that be the way to travel? She came with her brother Cornelius Cavan, also brother to Ari's dad. The Cavans and Mulcahys were great friends from years back, and Delia wrote to Ari when she arrived in Chicago to suggest that Harry take dance classes with Ella, Dennis Mulcahy's daughter. Ari was 10 then, and she took the classes and never stopped, and taught us a lot of dance moves. "Sounds like so much fun," said Ilona, "and so unlike what I grew up with. When I was 10, everything was still very, very dark, as it had been all along." Tep looked at her questioningly. "Oh, I loved my family, and we had good times overall, but we never had any money, and it was always a struggle. We had come from Hungary, which wasn't what you'd call a party place at that time. Not like the freedom you had in California. Not everything was fun and games in California, not for everyone. One of the best musicians I ever played with was a guy called Enrique Martinez, a very cool sax player. He had grown up in an area south of Los Angeles called Chavez Ravine. He used to talk about how great it was, totally removed from the city and very, very poor. But it was a real community, and he loved it. He took me there one time in the 30s. You had to climb a huge hill coming from the outskirts of L.A., and it was a dirt path that wound around and finally led to the streets of houses. I remember seeing a father bouncing along on his bike with his daughter on the handlebars. Shopping bags, too, and I was thinking, what a hard life. Sort of feeling sorry for them. And just as I thought that, they went over a big hole in the road, and they laughed and laughed. And I realized how loving and happy they both were, how many people with much more were not able to enjoy life in the same way. But where I grew up, and in our times, you're right, Tep continued, there was a spirit of freedom and big openness to everything. We did have fun. Tep paused. It didn't last forever, though. Nothing does. The war started, the U.S. got involved in 1917, and things changed. Ari's father enlisted, and we grew up a bit. We still had fun times, but we also became more serious. Ari and I became very close. Ilona made a "tell me more" gesture and waited expectantly. It had always seemed like we were connected spirits somehow, as if we'd known each other even before we met. We had a love that was pure, and a given from the start, and although maybe by the time we were 13 and 14, she was the older one, we wandered into a more adult kind of experimentation. Were you lovers? Ilona asked, trying to integrate the image of children making love. We were lovers even if we had never done more than kissing, he said. Although we did do more than kiss. She was an adventurous girl, and I was an eager young boy. When her father died, not that long after enlisting, she and her mother decided to leave San Francisco. We were both crushed by the development. We went to our secret hideaway in a little spinney, and yes, we made love. It was our first, and as it turned out, our last time. In the silence that followed, birds twittered, and the cries of children at play floated across the airwaves. Ilona watched a cloud feathering itself into nothing, and waited again, and finally Tep spoke. They moved to Chicago to be with that Aunt Delia. Ari died the next year of the influenza that broke out. The disease was everywhere. It was a worldwide crisis. And Chicago was hard hit. 38,000 cases. More than 8,000 people died in just 8 weeks. Ilona frowned as she watched the ducks in the little pond nearby. She sighed as she thought, "Your first love. How sad a story. You would have been together now." "Maybe," answered Tep, "although who knows what paths we would have taken. I think, though, that the bond we had would have lasted. You know," he added as he too looked out across the pond, "the first time I saw you, I thought you were Ari." "No, you don't look like her," he said as Ilona looked inquiringly at him. "But my mind just substituted her for you for a moment. I looked out from the stage, and for a second I was totally confused. Then everything reestablished itself, and you were simply you again. Still, I felt like she was leading me to you. That's why I went to your table. And I thought you were just a wild guy on the loose, looking for a little action. I had no idea I was entering such a significant narrative. Good thing, too, or I might have been intimidated even more than I was." "You were intimidated?" Tep laughed. "Why on earth?" "Oh, maybe because I was an innocent and inexperienced, immature girl who had stayed at home too long, immersed in books, and totally ignorant of the ways of the world. And you were you. A famous and accomplished musician, known around the world. Cool, good-looking, even though you were much older than me." Tep looked at her with mock indignation. "And you were comfortable and confident with yourself. You thought I was good-looking. Maybe that's what made you blind to the real me. In fact, I was not that confident at all, not with you. In fact, I was nervous, not sure of what I was doing, except for that nudge I thought I felt from the past. But we seemed to settle right away into an easy rapport." "Yes, we did." Ilona smiled. "And I don't know how to define what I felt, only that my heart was connected for the first time in my life. It was a strange but strong affinity, and hearing you describe your relationship with Ari, it reminds me of how we are now." "Except for the fact that you're married," she added that in her head. The park had lost many of its occupants, and they realized that they too had to go.
Mama gonna rock you, mama gonna rock you, mama gonna rock you now. Because the world needs a lot of what mama can give, so mama gonna rock you now. Well, baby's going with her, baby's going with her, baby's going with her too. Because baby's happy when mama feels fine, so baby's going with her too. Mama's singing, mama's playing, mama hallelujah, I love her so. Mama dancing, dancing, dancing. Well, mama gonna do it, so you gonna know. Well, mama gonna swing it, she gonna wing it, mama gonna swing it hard. Because it don't mean a thing if your mama don't swing.
1949. Peary! Ilona called out across the south campus of City College and ran to catch up with her friend. Back in secondary and in grade school, she had known Piroska, daughter of another Hungarian refugee family, who were neighbors, immigrants like the Szabos. Both girls had grown up in the strange American loneliness, although Peary was a few years younger. She had caught up with Ilona at the college, after Ilona lost a few years working to help her father when her mother died. At City, Peary had swiftly shortened her name, pleased that it was less distinguishable from the modern and often heard names of other girls. She and Ilona had both chosen the college not only because it was a free public institution for higher education, the only one available to working-class students, but also because of its record of success. The, quote, Harvard of the proletariat, quote, had been producing more Nobel laureates than any other U.S. public university since 1935. It also nurtured debate and a high level of radical thinking. Coming from homes that had escaped revolution, poverty, and discord in their country of origin, both Peary and Ilona had been brought up to appreciate political thought and an inquisitive environment. They had loved hearing about the Bertrand Russell scandal when he was denied an appointment as professor by the conformist people of New York back in 1940, and they especially liked his response, calling the incident a, quote, typical American witch hunt. Ilona chose the Spitzer School of Architecture, and Peary enrolled in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. They often attended spirited debates. "Hi, Ilona!" Peary slowed her step to wait for her friend, and together they walked towards Shepherd Hall and the cafeteria. "What's for lunch?" she asked Ilona. "I mean, besides the usual battle of opinions that's always going on in Alcove 1. "Cold goulash and langosh, my favorite," answered Ilona, using the Hungarian words for goulash and the deep-fried flat bread, and rolling her eyes. My dear mother always thought that home cooking is necessary to an education. And maybe she was right. In any case, I still like these things, even if I supplement them with a Coke. She would roll over, you know, if she saw me drinking that stuff. She used to say it was good only for cleaning paintbrushes, which I believe, but I drink it anyway. By the way, have you seen Goldie? I didn't see her this morning. I think she was at that kibbutz meeting. She was interested in going over to Israel sometime. That's right, I forgot, said Ilona. I know the Abelsons are very active in the socialist movement. It goes back to her grandparents, when they first arrived in New York, early part of the century. I don't know that much about their particular history, only that they support labor unions, and I tend to agree with that. Too many unscrupulous and rich factory owners around. The common worker needs some protection. Yeah, I guess. Peary was distracted as Tom Sinclair, a classmate, passed them. She waved. "Hey!" he hollered. "Do you have that theater piece done yet?" They were both in the humanities and the arts. "No," said Peary, "haven't even started. Want to work together?" "Yes, indeedy, I do. I do. You give me vision. You are a vision of loveliness." Tom swept his arm out to swirl himself around Peary. Ilona gave Peary a look as she walked on. Piri was a good-looking girl, short curly brown hair, green-gray eyes that liked to laugh a lot. Piri liked to have fun in general, and was attracted to the subversive a little bit. She did her own pirouette around Tom, and offered a plan to meet the next day after classes. Then she laughed as the friends continued their way to lunch. "Tom's a bit of a crazy one," she said, "but I like him. Yes, before you batter me with questions." "Nothing wrong with love," Ilona said. Then she added, "I could use a bit of it myself if I had any time, which I don't, so no use in thinking along those lines." She sighed. "Later, maybe." "All work and no play," countered Piri. "Yeah, I know, but I've got to get through my courses and start to earn some real money. I never realized the amount of work I would have. Engineering, history of architecture, building materials, even city planning and bylaws. It's a heavy load. Love for me is only in the songs I hear on the radio. I emote vicariously through Johnny Ray, or when I hear Body and Soul, which I've loved since I was about 12. That's what I want when I do finally find love, if I do. Body and soul," she murmured. "You will. You're beautiful, smart, fun to be with, not to mention determined. You're like one of those plants that force their way up through the cement. Very determined." Answered Ilona. "Those plants are one of my favorite things. I always marvel at their tenacity. As for me, I have to be determined. If my mother hadn't already left this world, she would die for sure if I didn't complete my education and become someone who added to the good of the world. She used to tell me stories at bedtime. She'd just make them up, with heroines that could fly and fight and ferret out the truth always. Sometimes she'd add singing to their talents, just to make them more persuasive against their enemies. She had a whole squadron of valiant women, and a young girl who was always calling to them, 'Take me with you,' so that I would end up wanting to go with those heroic campaigners too." Ilona smiled at the memory. "I only wish you were here to see me graduate." "Don't worry. Our days at the Army Hall dorm will be over before you know it. You'll graduate, and when you do, she'll be here, and after that, you'll be designing buildings for the world. I know it. Like, what's his name? You know, Mr. Wright, the famous architect of space." "Oh, yes. Frank Lloyd. Well, if I could do a fraction of what he did, with maybe just a tenth of his talent, I'd be happy. But right now, I'd be happy if I could eat. It takes a lot to push through cement, and I need fueling. Let's go." They caught up to their friend Goldie as they arrived at the cafeteria.
Life blooms, petals open, my heart booms full of hoping. The world is so much nicer with flowers. It's love that the earth displays, so sweet as it simply says, "Come sit in the shade of my bowers." Take time to enjoy the rose, see how that old cedar grows. Eat fruit that grows wild in the meadows. It's love that the earth displays, so sweet as it simply says, "Don't fret, watch the leaves as the wind blows."
1952. Ilona walked across the campus lawn with her father, her sister Yolande, and her two younger brothers, Christophe and Emile. They saw the chairs set out in the sunshine for the graduation ceremony. Yolande, at 15, was looking around with wonder at the buildings of the college and watching her big sister with pride, trying to walk with the same sophistication. Her brothers were attempting to be cool. Christophe, 19, newly employed with the New York City police force, wanted to eventually do detective work and moved with what he thought was a stride that evoked respect from the community. Emile, 17, had applied to the same city college that Ilona had attended, and was a youthful promise of a man he would become. They all still lived at home with Papa Stefan, but Ilona had already decided she would get her own apartment on graduation, and Emil, in turn, had already asked if in a few years he could bunk in with her. A rush of black and gold came streaming towards them, and suddenly Goldie was there, laughing and hugging Ilona, grinning at the other family members as Ilona introduced them. "Isn't this wonderful?" Goldie exclaimed. "I can't believe we're actually here after all those years and all the work. Oh, God, Ilona, this feels good." She laughed, a rich and resonant sound, accompanied by the gleeful swinging of her body and her long, blonde, wavy hair, and almost swept the whole group into a hug. "I am now officially an aeronautics engineer." Yolan's eyes widened and filled with a kind of reverence for this Wonder Woman. She hadn't even heard of aeronautics, didn't know what it meant, but she understood that Goldie had achieved something that most women hadn't. Goldie saw the look and smiled at Yolan. "Oh no," she said, "I'm not the first by any means. Way back in the 4th or 5th century, that's 1400 years ago, a woman named Hypatia of Alexandria invented the hydrometer, and in the 19th century there were many women who studied engineering and completed degrees. In the universities that granted them to women, that is. Sort of a joke," she continued. "Women were behind a lot of discoveries, like Ada Lovelace, who was Lord Byron's daughter, by the way. She was considered the first computer programmer. But, as usual, they were unknown to the general public. In the 20th century, there were quite a few female engineers, and I'm proud to be one of them. My mother is beside herself, she's so proud, and my father is almost handing out cigars. He doesn't know how else to brag about me to his friends." "No one should be surprised," said Ilona. "Your parents are so intelligent and involved with what goes on in the world, science and politics and literature. It's only natural that their daughter should make a mark and contribute in this dawn of new technology. After all, your father is a mathematics teacher, isn't he? And your mom a writer?" "Yes," said Goldie, "and for sure they wanted me to succeed. But the big push for them, as they said countless times, was that family is first." "As it should be," interjected Stefan Sabo, with a significant glance around to all his children. "As it should be," repeated Goldie, "but family will have to wait a bit for me. I have no intention of getting married for a long time. Maybe I never will. I can't wait to get involved in my work, and I want it to carry me around the world. In fact, I'm going to start by doing that, learn to fly like Amelia Earhart, so that someday I can actually make that trip on my own, like her." Ilona's father had a fleeting look of sadness on his face and said to the group, "Ah, yes, Miss Earhart. Ilona's mother, too, wanted to fly like her. It's sad she never did." And he added, "And sad she is not here to see you fly, my Ilonka." Ilona gave him a kiss. "She's here," she said, "and I'm sure she has her pantheon of flying heroines all gathered with her to watch today's events. The Take Me With You squadron," she quietly added to herself. "Come on." Goldie grabbed her arm and started across the field to where the other graduates were gathered. "Let's find Piri." The girls looked out at the field, transformed by the day's proceedings, the day surrounded by roses and peonies and begonias, the flags fluttering in the wind, the people dressed in their Sunday best. The trees were gracefully dancing forwards and back, performing a charming Renaissance dance, underlining the renewing wave of knowledge as it was passed forward once again through a new generation. They walked a few moments in silence, letting the serenity paint them into the scene, knowing that this time was never to come again. "Speaking of parents and absences, does Piri have anyone here for her?" asked Goldie. They were both well acquainted with the bizarre tale of Piri's arrival in America. Her father had abducted her in Hungary and taken her from her mother to settle in New York. But shortly after, falling to hard times, he was unable to continue with her upbringing and put her into care. For a while he maintained a relationship of sorts, but eventually left the state looking for work, and over the years, traveling to survive became his life. His daughter grew up in different homes in foster care, with no idea who or where her mother was, and no one seemed to be able to tell her anything. Her father had not filled in any names when he brought her to the home. After a while, there was no further contact with him. I think she doesn't have anyone, although she's been sort of adopted by the couple who run the boarding house where she lives. They are lovely people, whose children have all left, so they rent out the children's room to students. They seem to have taken a liking to Peary, and no doubt they will be here, said Ilona. They've met Tom, too, and approve of him. I think they even turn a blind eye on occasion when Peary breaks the late-night visitor rules. It's hard not to like her, Goldie said. They had met at the college, and she enjoyed the gutsy spirit she saw in Peary, the scrabbly way she had of fighting for her place and her rights, of collecting the parts she wanted to build her life from wherever she happened to be. She doesn't seem to ever have a plan, and yet when you look at the whole picture, see her direction and activities, it all fits. She seems to follow some inner course that she's willing to change at a moment's notice to incorporate some new idea that appeals to her. I like her determination. And she's fun, she added, thinking of the costumes and dialects Peary would use at parties. Remember that time she came as a lady of the night? She played that part well, and shocked some people. Peary doesn't worry about what other people think. She's been on her own too long. As unhappy as her story is, it made her very independent and strong, and it's given her a crazy sense of humor. Tom is a good foil for her, and he seems to care for her a lot. They both view the world as a stage for the unpredictable, and for new responses, which they enjoy. I wouldn't be surprised if they stay together. It was at that moment that Peary came up and joined them, rolling from side to side with a mock limp. She shoved her mortarboard back like a newsboy's cap and greeted them. "How's it going, ladies? I was just thinking that I might see yous." She was into her Cockney impersonation, one of her favorites.
I was walking in the woods one day and I was thinking I'm a long, long way from my daddy and my mama too, and I don't know yet if I can count on you. I'm trying to do right with my basket of goods, so don't you hurt me, man. I'm just Red Riding Hood. Now I've heard some, but there's plenty bad. There are some folks, they're gonna make you sad with the evil and their cruel ways. It's hard to know then what my own heart says. I gotta follow my path the way I see, so don't you hurt me, man. No, don't you jump on me. Ooh, walking wrong.
1954. Ilona walked along the streets of New York to her office building, her long legs striding, her dark wavy hair matching the swinging of her flared skirt, and her shoes somewhere between heels and a sensible work pump, making their purposeful tap down the sidewalk. She loved the walk every morning, and she loved the freedom, from classes at the city college, from the years prior to college when she was helping her father with the family, from the early years in Queens, where her parents had settled in Woodside, which, although happy enough, had never prepared her for the delirium of discovery that she experienced in study and in simply seeing what the world had to offer. She walked by the automat, the self-serve eatery that drew crowds every lunchtime. She looked in restaurants, making a mental note to get to Palmer's, an old favorite back in Queens, and to visit the new boathouse in Central Park that she'd heard about. She'd heard, too, about the music in the Cotton Club and the Apollo up in Harlem, which fascinated her. Someday she would go there, she decided. Meanwhile, she walked by a poster for the movie Rear Window. She would see that, and the one with Marlon Brando, too, on the waterfront. She'd read about the film. Theater outings, yes, she would do it all. She had seen Guys and Dolls when it first opened a couple of years earlier, and there was always something new happening. She was excited by the variety of life, by the color and modes of expression from the many immigrant families, by the music which was so joyful and plentiful in the city, and by the history. She was especially excited by the connection she felt to the architecture, a thread woven into her consciousness by Stefan Sabo, her father. With him, she had learned to look at buildings and shapes and the beautiful detail that an artist had managed to include in the practicality of his or her design. On her own, she looked and watched even more, and read as much as she could about new trends and ideas. She kept her sketchbook with her at all times to record any thoughts or imaginary structures that she envisioned. She loved living in New York, one of the most exciting cities in the world. It was a time of great hope and invention. The horrors of the Second World War had finally receded, and people were looking forward to all the wonderful new technology that was making life so much easier. It was a far cry from the end of the First World War and the times her parents had suffered through in Hungary. There, in Budapest, where they lived, the revolution had begun in 1918, lasting only until 1919 and a second revolution, resulting in the creation of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, a communist state. Chaos reigned in the country. Unemployment, inflation, and poverty were rampant. Stefan and his wife Marika worked hard to improve themselves, but it was hard. Their first baby, Teresa, died at 1 year of age. They had their second daughter, Ilona, 2 years later, and when she was 3 years old, they all made the trip to the New World. Ilona looked up at the New York skyline. She saw the Empire State Building and its beautiful Art Deco design. There were so many fabulous styles in the city. The Waldorf Astoria, also Art Deco. Grand Central Station, in the Beaux-Arts style. St. Patrick's Cathedral with its Gothic towers, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Woolworths Building. Fantastic. Smaller treasures abounded as well on the residential streets and in the various shops. And above all, to her father, the famous Statue of Liberty, which he had rhapsodized over so often. Of course, to him, it was not just the architecture, with the engineering team that included the famous Gustave Eiffel, but the promise of a new life, the life they had given her. She got to the front door of her firm's building, and she stopped for just a second as she entered, a habit she had begun on her first day on the job. At that time, it was a moment that made her take a breath, and she had the short but very satisfying pleasure of saying to herself, "I'm here. I made it. I got through the course, and I'm doing what I love." She continued the practice because every day she wanted to renew that excitement and gratitude. As she made her way to the elevator, she ran into Marge and Harry, 2 co-workers. Harry had been very helpful to her when she first started, reviewing staff and projects and important clients and timelines. He always encouraged individual thinking. He asked how she was doing on the latest proposal they were making for a job on the outskirts of the city, and Ilona was explaining her ideas as the elevator doors closed.
Sweet summer morning with your loving, sweet summer rising all in bloom. I have such sweet, sweet feelings as I wrap myself around you. There are sweet memories being born in this room. Outside the sunshine warms the cool grass. The rose petals drip with all the dew. I hear the twitter of the bird songs as they echo in the garden, and I lose myself in kisses shared with you. the ringing of a bell's chime. The world is changed with everything we do.
Early 1958. I love this part of your body, Tip said, tracing the curve and dip of her waist and hip as she lay on her side in bed with him. It's so beautiful and perfect, so classic of form, so reminiscent of ideals. You're a painting come to life. Ilona loved his touch. He had the quietness and focus that she saw in his piano playing, each note a step that had his full attention, even while his mind was flying with intuition and unconscious connections. She imagined a loving teacher being with her patiently, opening her heart and mind, guiding her each step of the way that was their road together. She loved him naturally and completely, not analyzing or expecting anything, but responding in kind to his gift of play and passion. The passion was an undercurrent to every move they made. They had discovered it on their first night together as soon as they touched, the blood she had drawn on his back shocking them both. Now, after many times together, the passion came to the surface easily, carrying them along its wild and uncharted course. Making love was like improvising on a melody, one that excited them both to creative heights. She learned from him, and, as with music, experienced free-flowing ideas that expanded their boundaries and definitions of their separate selves. It got better over time, harmonious, beautiful, mysterious, but absolutely matched. Their love was familiar, a reunion. Later, still in bed, they talked about dreams. Ilona was surprised to hear that, like her, Tep recorded his dreams. It increased her sense of connection with him to know he recognized the subconscious, that he acknowledged and listened to it. She told him about some of her strange dreams, ones from which she awoke feeling as though she had actually traveled to another place and experienced a life quite separate from her own. "A few times," she said, "I've seen the same place and had the same feeling of knowing it and being somewhere that was home to me. There's a lake and a hill and gorgeous fields all around, which sometimes look green, but other times are filled with a golden light. I run down the hill and I can hear someone calling me, but not Ilona. That's not my name in the dream. But I don't hear clearly. It just seems like sounds coming over the airwaves. Sometimes when I wake up, I want to go back so badly." "So, you're not the untraveled person you claimed to be when we met. You just have your own private airlines in your head. You're lucky. I know a lot of cats who pay big bucks to get high like that. And then they're bummed out when they come down, or they stay high and miss gigs. A lot of guys have ruined great careers looking for that golden light. I wonder who you were in your dream. I can't imagine you not being Ilona." "Oh, I can, easily. At least I would like to imagine it. I'd actually like to have another name." "What? Why?" Tep asked, beginning a new trace painting on her arm. He wrote her name and circled it a few times. "What does it mean in Hungarian?" "Oh, it has a nice meaning. Torch. But because of my history, I've never liked it," she said. "It was such a foreign name in early school, when we had just come from Hungary. It's not your typical American name, and to the other kids, it sounded like alone. And I was alone for a long time. I didn't really fit in, especially in my old-fashioned clothes. I wanted to be Nancy or Peggy or Norma. Anything but the alone girl." "Well, I like it," Ted said. "And one day I'm going to write a song about us, and I'll call it Mr. Alone. No one else will know the secret of the words. It will be my homage to our love, and it will be my torch for you. But right now, just so you know, I don't want you to change anything. Rodgers and Hart wrote this song in 1937, and it says what I mean very well." With that, Tep started to sing My Funny Valentine to her. He had a rough but very tuneful voice, and she could hear the phrasing that in her 2 years with him she had learned to recognize as jazz. She had never experienced such an enchantingly private and personal gift of love. She was moved to rapt attention by the intimacy of the moment, his voice, his breath on her. She thought to herself, I'm never going to forget this. This is golden. Tep finished the song and smiled at her. Let's get up, he said. There's something on tonight I think you'll like. Monk's got his card back and he's playing at the 5 spot. I've got time before my late flight. You're perfect. So, baby, we're stepping out. Let's hit the street. He pulled his lanky frame up off the bed. Ilona watched him dress and brush his dark hair into place. He was 24 years older than her, but definitely full of life, and she cherished the time they had together. Too soon it would end when he once again went on the road with his music. She refused to think about his going home, his wife, and whatever kind of relationship they had. She focused instead on the present and the immediate future. She got up and dressed herself, choosing an outfit suitable for the famous jazz spot. She put a scarf around her head and tied it on the side, and looked at Tep expectantly. Very fetching, he said, and she smiled at the old-fashioned word.